My guest today is Dr. Reid Meloy, forensic psychologist, consultant to FBI, faculty member of San Diego Psychoanalytic Center, and former clinical professor of psychiatry at University of California, San Diego. Hello and welcome, Dr. Meloy.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Dr. Meloy, you kindly agreed to talk about profiling the school shooters today. But I would like first to introduce you to our audience since you have had a most interesting life and career. Besides being in academia as a professor at University of California, San Diego, visiting professor at Yale University and University Hospital in Zurich, you also have this other part of career in sharing your forensic skills. For example, for the past 20 years, you have been consultant to behavioral analysis unit Quantico at FBI. Can you tell us something about that?
Actually, I can't talk about any of the details there, just because of the nature of the work. But I can say a little bit about the program there. The behavioral analysis unit gets a lot of attention in the media because it typically, historically, has been a place that has tried to investigate and understand some of the most bizarre and violent acts that have occurred primarily in the United States, and then be available as consultants to law enforcement agencies around the United States when these cases occur. So, for instance, if there was like a mass shooting at a particular location in the United States, then the local police might invite the behavioral analysis unit to come in to provide consultation to the local police to help them understand what happened, to gather evidence in understanding the motivation of the individual that carried out the acts. So it's been a leader in the United States to help understand some of the most difficult and extreme and violent cases that have occurred. And that has, of course, contributed to its reputation over the decades. It actually started now about 40 years ago. So it's been around a very long time. And some of the early individuals that began the behavioral analysis unit, actually focused initially on things like serial murder and serial rape and those kinds of crimes, which people knew nothing about. And the small group that had started the behavioral analysis unit then went out and did something that was unheard of at the time, and that is they actually interviewed these people. So they went into the jails and the prisons and the forensic hospitals and actually talked to these individuals to try to understand their psychological functioning and why they did what they did. And the simple step of actually talking to these extremely violent individuals was very helpful in advancing the science of understanding of how they thought and how they felt and how they went about planning and preparing for their acts of violence. So that was a very simple but enormously important step that was taken by the founders of the behavioral analysis unit. And that tradition has continued with doing research and investigations that on, in a sense, the cutting edge of understanding these problems.
Dr. Meloy, you were also a technical consultant at television series CSI from its start in 2000 until its final episode in 2015. You also did some other work in television. So what kind of work did you do there, and what was your part in filming these shows?
Well, my experience with CSI was I was one of many technical consultants to the program. And one of the reasons that program was so successful for so many years and watched by so many people was that they used people with expertise in developing and writing their storylines and their scripts. So they tried to stay as accurate as possible, with, of course, the embellishment that happens in television and in movies. But the accuracy really helped in creating a series that was very compelling for people. That also carried over from CSI into another television series that a friend of mine was heavily involved in, and that was Criminal Minds. And Criminal Minds was another television series that's been enormously popular. But that's because and I did not work on that series, but my friend was a consultant and a producer on that program, and that helped really advance how specific and focused the scripts were. And so the viewer, I think the appeal of those programs is people are emotionally fully engaged in an exciting drama, but at the same time they learn something technologically that they didn't know before. And that combination of new learning and emotional engagement is very, very powerful, particularly in the media and in films. The most recent thing I've done was a series that we did for Paramount let's see, we did this now about I think it was finished about a year ago, but it was a series that my good friend Molly Ammon, who's a retired FBI agent, and I were the content experts for, and that was a 6-part series to try to understand what happened on January 6th here in the United States with the attack on the Capitol. And it was called Indivisible, and I think
Healing
it was
Hope.
Healing Hope, right?
Hope,
Healing Heat, yeah. And it was a very, I think it turned out to be a very well done series in terms of helping us understand the roots of January 6th here in the United States.
Dr. Meloy, for the past 30 years, you have been consulting, researching, and writing about personality disorders, psychopathy, stalking, narcissism, criminality, mental disorder, and targeted violence. And together with Dr. Hoffman, you are the editor of International Handbook for Threat Assessment, a book that has become a gold standard textbook, and it's a comprehensive resource for mental health practitioners, law enforcement, and professionals to prevent targeted violence. What is the threat assessment? How does it work? And how can be applied to school shootings?
Yeah, Vanna, that's a very important question. Threat assessment came about because of violence that was planned and purposeful, was not spontaneous, was not reactive, was not impulsive. But when these events began to be looked at, it turned out that these individuals, whether adolescents or adults, had planned and prepared for this act of violence, typically over the course of weeks or several months in some cases. And it was a way to try to think about how we could develop an understanding of movement of these individuals. And that came to be called the pathway to violence. Mm-hmm. Understanding the pathway to violence with the hope that if somebody was identified to be on a pathway to violence, there could be an intervention that would stop them or divert them or keep them from carrying out their act. And this became the discipline, the scientific discipline of threat assessment and threat management. And again, now we're talking about the roots of this go back into the 1980s. So we're now at about the 40-year point for the development of this field. So it's starting to mature, but it's still very young as a scientific discipline. But we've learned a lot over the past decades of why individuals carry out these acts, what they do in their various in the various stages of the pathway to violence, and then what we can successfully do to try to intervene and keep these events from happening. And so that's the early genesis of the field.
So how do you assess a threat?
Well, the first model that we have is actually very simple, and that is to identify, assess, and manage. So the first step is we try to identify if there's a threat. And then secondly, we try to assess what is the threat specifically and what is the level of risk in the threat. And then thirdly, what are steps we can take to try to manage the threat? So identify, assess, and manage is a very important part of the model. Secondly, what we found is that this works best when there's a team approach. And for instance, in a high school or in a college or university, typically the team is made up of a core group of individuals. In a high school, for instance, it might be the school counselor, the school resource officer that typically is a police officer, and then thirdly, an administrator at the school. So that could be like the principal or the vice principal. And they make up what we call the threat assessment team. Now, some schools don't like the word threat associated with their school. So they use terms like behavioral intervention team. That's actually very, very popular. People like that term, particularly people in education. But it's essentially trying to identify the student of concern early on before they mount an attack. So somehow there can be an intervention. So the multidisciplinary team concept is also very important. And then the recognition that this team has to work very closely together. And in a sense, they have to put their heads together, that they can't just make these decisions on their own. And they have to plan carefully as to what's going to be the best intervention. And let me give you a very specific example from a school. Say we know that oftentimes kids who get on a pathway to violence, and here I'm talking about adolescents, oftentimes will be clinically depressed. They'll be very angry. They'll be alienated from the other kids at school. They won't have any friends. Typically, things at home are pretty disorganized. There may be parents may not be being very effective in how they're working with their child. I'm doing a case right now where they had a very mentally ill son, and the parents, as a way to respond to his mental illness, told him to just suck it up, that he didn't need anything else other than to be strong. And then they got him a handgun for his birthday and then took him to a shooting range to practice. So we see these absolutely horrible parental steps being taken in some of these cases. But the key is to try to intervene early on in the case before the child, the adolescent, in this case, the teenager, will move on this pathway to the point where he's planning and preparing to carry out an act of violence. And depending on where he is along the pathway, the team will plan for an intervention that might be most effective. For instance, if you're seeing the kid, if you identify the child perhaps that's just clinically depressed and isolated at school, then the intervention is not to kick him out of school. The intervention is to bring in mental health care, bring in a psychologist, a psychiatric social worker, people that can work closely with that child, and typically can work closely with the family to provide him or her the help that he needs. And that would be very, very early on in the pathway. But if we went way down the pathway to where the child has brought a weapon to school, it's way too late for counseling at that moment. It's way too late for mental health intervention. Typically, with a situation like that, you would need a police intervention, to take away the weapon, to confiscate the weapon, to then intervene in a much more assertive way with the child and with the family, to try to get them the kind of help they need to stabilize that situation. So it all depends on where they are on the pathway to violence, how quickly are they moving on that pathway, and then what can we do to intervene to be as helpful as possible as a threat assessment or behavioral intervention team.
Dr. Meloy, how to recognize them? Is there something, is there a typical school shooter? What do they have in common?
Yeah, typically there's not a typical school shooter.
Okay.
And it's very important to recognize that there's not a profile, a specific profile of a school shooter. But we do know some very important things about their behavior. For instance, we know that the vast majority of adolescent school shooters will communicate to a third party their intent to carry out an act of violence. And we call that leakage.
Mm-hmm.
So what they do is they leak their intent to a third party. So one of the very important things that schools do is they set up systems that are very welcoming to the school community, in the sense that if you're a student at the school, it's very easy for you to communicate with the school authorities that they've heard about a threat, or they've heard about a student who says he's going to bring a gun to school. And we call that being a very good bystander. Mm-hmm. That, in other words, when you hear something like that as a student, that you communicate that to the school authorities. And so you have to have a very welcoming process in order for that to happen. The students have to trust that if they communicate this to the behavioral intervention team, the team is going to do the right thing. So we know that leakage is a very, very common behavior that we pay very close attention to. Go ahead.
No, please do.
No. Another important characteristic that we look at is that oftentimes these kids are pretty isolated at school. In other words, they don't have a strong, trusting connection with an adult at the school. And so schools have developed ways of trying to identify the students that appear to be most isolated, to bring them in contact with a trusted adult at the school that can talk to them, that can establish a friendship, that can establish some rapport with them, and help them feel connected and more engaged with the school. One of the things we're looking at right now from a research perspective is what we call misanthropy, and that's a word, being a misanthrope. And a lot of people don't understand that word, but it's the opposite of being a philanthropist. Engaging in philanthropy out of the love of humanity. Misanthropy is hatred of humanity. And one of the things we're noticing is one of the final steps that these kids will take in terms of their beliefs is they feel completely alienated and hateful toward humanity in general. And that can be like a last step in their thinking before they engage in the violence. You know, it becomes a very, in a sense, a very, what we call in our world, a sort of a very regressed, simple belief system of misanthropy. And so we're starting to do a little bit of research around that, you know, that notion. And then, of course, you have, along with the isolation and development of sort of a generalized hatred for your target, which may be your school, is oftentimes there have been either one event or a series of events that have stimulated what we call a personal grievance. So there's a personal sense of being of losing something that's very important to you, being humiliated by that loss, being very angry about that loss, and then blaming, like if we're continuing to talk about schools, and then blaming somebody at school, perhaps a teacher, several teachers, the administrator, some other kids at school, whatever it might be. So we have this personal grievance that comes about that has four elements to it: a loss, humiliation, anger, and blame. And so, and most of these kids, about 80% of them, will have an identified personal grievance. And again, it could be a series of events, or it could be just one event. And that tends to also then move them to thinking that perhaps violence is the way out. Violence is the way that I solve this problem, that I retaliate against these other people. I avenge the ways in which I've been hurt. And this all becomes a part of their thinking.
Dr. Meloy, do they think in this moment about themselves and how they're going to get on after they do?
Well, that's a great question, Ivana. Some of the kids will plan for their suicide, that as a part of killing other people, that they know that their life is going to end. And so they plan for suicide, either taking their own life or being killed by the police. But what we found is that with most of the adolescent shooters, they don't commit suicide. When they're in the midst of the violence itself, as soon as the police arrive, they typically will give up. They will surrender because they get very scared. They get very scared with what they're doing. It's quite different from the adults. With the adults, you do see higher rates of suicide connected to the mass shooting. So with the adults, you're more likely to see a suicide homicide dynamic being played out, but not so much for the adolescents. So even though they may think and plan that this is going to be the end of my life, oftentimes it doesn't turn out that way. They tend to, when the police arrive, they tend to stop what they're doing. Now, again, I say tend to because you do get cases where they explicitly engage in behavior to be killed by the police, and we've seen that in a number of situations.
So it is often said that mass shooters and even school shooters, these kids, are looking for the attention. So is this true? And can we call some crimes performance crimes?
Yeah, very good. That's an interesting question, too. Some of the kids are attention seeking. We had a case in Florida that involved a teenager named Nicholas Cruz, and he was very specific about wanting to be remembered, wanting to achieve a level of notoriety or infamy so people would remember him. But oftentimes this comes from a very dark, depressed place of not feeling that a part of the community, that they're not connected to other people at school. They feel very, very alienated. So out of that darkness comes this sense of notoriety that I can gain through killing other people. And what's really hard for people to, and I'll try this with the audience. What's really hard for people to grasp is that imagine that you're a 16-year-old boy and life is just not going very well. As Tom Friedman said, he's never held a job or a girl's hand, and things are not positive, and every day is drudgery. Every day things do not go very well. That the withdrawal into violent fantasy, and this is what's hard for people to grasp, the withdrawal then into violent fantasy can leave you feeling better. It can actually bring with it very positive, good feelings, because you feel powerful, you feel omnipotent, you feel larger than life. And with the internet, of course, you can immerse yourself in these fantasies. You can find other people that also share these fantasies. You can spend hours and hours of immersion in these very violent, grandiose worlds on the internet. So all this tends to reinforce the sense of what we call a new dark identity. So the self-identity begins to shift from just being a teenager with the usual issues to something much darker and much more powerful. But again, see, the very positive feelings that one can get from that can move one forward to engage more deeply in that identity. Nicholas Cruz, a very specific example, in his what we call identification as a risk factor, his identification, he posted on a YouTube channel, "I want to be a professional school shooter." He posted that on a YouTube channel, and that was reported by the YouTube channel owner to the police. But the police botched the investigation. They did not do a good job of intervention and helping Cruz at all. It was a very poorly managed intervention. Actually, it was no intervention at all. But see, that statement, "I want to be a professional school shooter." See, there's that seeking of that dark identity. So we always look very carefully for the emergence of a self-identity that is like that, because that's a very, very ominous sign that there is trouble ahead with this particular person, and there needs to be some kind of intervention. And usually the interventions are a combination of mental health and then law enforcement if necessary. That you want to have those kinds of interventions as very much a part of your threat operation at your school.
Dr. Meloy, you are the author of the book Psychopathic Mind. Are school shooters psychopaths? And what role, if any, does mental illness play in school shootings?
There can be a variety of different problems with again, some of the school shooters are clearly young psychopathic personalities. I think there's no question about that. You'll see psychopathic personalities among the school shooters, but not at all most of them. Most of them are going to have other kinds of troubles, and those troubles could involve major mental illness. They could involve very treatable mental disorders with the right help that's brought to bear. But then also you have some kids where the motivations typically do not fall into a diagnosed category of mental illness. It could be the accumulation of personal grievances coupled with very disorganized family at home, poor parenting, and unsecured firearms in the home where the kid can get to a firearm very easily. So in most of the cases, there's multiple factors that have contributed to risk in the particular case. One of those factors may be a mental disorder or perhaps even several mental disorders in the child. But typically, it's not just one contributing factor.
You also mentioned YouTube and that case, and you mentioned internet. What is the role of news and social media in regard to school shootings? I mean, can you connect the three?
Yeah, I think with kids that are at risk, that the media and social media and the news can contribute to that risk, because you can, particularly with social media and then just the larger internet itself, you can immerse yourself in very troubling communications that can take the child in the wrong direction. And I'm thinking here of just for a moment, thinking about extremism in relationship to these kinds of crimes, that if you find a website, like for instance, if we go back to the idea of just the thought experiment of being a 16-year-old boy who's having a troubled time at school and things are not going well, that he gets on the internet and he finds an internet site like Stormfront, which is an extreme right-wing website. And he goes into Stormfront, and given the radical right-wing extremist nature of that website, he begins to understand his troubles from a different perspective. And it may be a perspective of white supremacy, that my troubles in my life are being caused by people of color and by people immigrating into this country. And so he's now in a internet sphere of influence. And depending on how much time he spends there, that may have a very powerful impact on his thinking and how he conceives of the world and how he understands it. Because he's going to get a lot of support for parroting these kinds of thoughts, for thinking the same way that these other perhaps white supremacists think. He begins to agree with them. And as they communicate with each other, we know that when people are communicating with each other the same kinds of belief systems without any challenge to that belief system, it tends to make the belief system move in the direction of becoming more fundamentalist and more extreme. And so social media and the internet now tends to reinforce that, which I think is very concerning and should be very concerning for us. And a lot of the reasons for that is because for instance, the social media algorithms were designed to provide things to you that you liked, that you found appealing. So the algorithms would keep feeding you news and commentary that tended to move you in a more and more extreme direction. So that's an example of how the media can be heavily influential over particularly a young person's thinking and adolescent's thinking, where they have yet to kind of formulate their worldview in any kind of crystallized manner.
Dr. Meloy, many of us think, or see that the school shootings here in this country are on the rise, on the increase. And now they started happening in the countries that never happened before, like in Serbia. Is there a social contagion? What is going on?
There is some data that two things do occur with these highly publicized cases. And I make a distinction between contagion and copycat.
Mhm.
We know from some very good research that was done at Arizona State University by Professor Towers that there does seem to be an acute period, meaning a short period, of contagion when there's been a highly publicized shooting event. And that contagion period lasts about 2 weeks.
Mhm.
And there will be, during that contagion period, there's a greater likelihood that there will be another, for instance, school shooting. And that's what we call contagion. So about a 2-week window. And because of now the global nature of social media and the internet, contagion, I think, can spread almost instantly around the world because of the means by which we can communicate with one another. So I think that is very much there. And then secondly is copycat. And I see copycat as very different. Copycat is a much more chronic, slower process where there's typically a desire to imitate the person that's carried out the attack, and in a sense identify with them and be like them. And it's much more of a slow process where over the course of months and also years, that there are people, young people in particular, that want to copy what happened and do it again. And we have a very good example of that in the Columbine shootings that occurred in Colorado here in the United States in 1999. And a friend of mine, Mark Fullman, has looked at what he calls a Columbine effect. And he has found that since 1999, so over the past 20 years, there have been over 100 incidents where young people in particular tried to imitate what happened at Columbine. And they made specific references to the Columbine shooters, as well as what they dressed, what they wore, exactly what they did over the past 20 years, that there's been a copycat effect. And then we also saw a copycat effect. We had a very large domestic terrorism event here in the United States in 1995 with the Oklahoma City bombing. And the Columbine boys, 4 years later, wanted to carry out an act that was bigger than what happened at Oklahoma City. So they were imitating what Timothy McVeigh had done 4 years earlier in Oklahoma City, and were very specific about wanting to imitate what he had done. Fortunately, their bombs did not go off. They were only able to use their firearms, and their bombs didn't go off. So that would be an example of that copycat. So copycat is a much longer period where there's much more of a identification with the individuals that carried out the act, and it unfolds, and then there becomes a subculture, like a Columbine subculture, where people are drawn to wanting to imitate that particular act.
What is in mind of someone who wants to commit a copycat?
Two things. One is I want to be like the people that came before me that did this. I want to, in a sense, join that special, notorious club and be like those people. But at the same time, I want to be different and more notorious than those individuals. So the narcissism is a push-pull. The narcissism is I want to be like them. but then I also want to distinguish myself from them. And typically the way these folks will distinguish themselves is they'll do something innovative that hasn't been done before, or they'll try to have more casualties. They'll try to injure or kill more people. So you have innovation and number of casualties. And the people that engage in this behavior around the world now will be thinking along those lines. What can I do to distinguish myself? So there's this very interesting narcissistic push-pull that occurs in these cases.
Dr. Meloy, together with Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Sheridan, you are the author of the book Stalking, Threatening, and Attacking Public Figures. And for all of the people who are watching us now, apart from your work as a consultant for Quantico or FBI, you were also a member of the Fixated Research Group for the United Kingdom's Home Office concerning threats to the royal family and the British political figures. Do terrorists, stalkers, and mass shooters have something in common?
Well, that's a very good question. What comes to mind first for me is of the groups that you've mentioned, a common thread is that typically these acts are not spontaneous, reactive, impulsive events, that these are planned, prepared for, and carried out over the course of days, weeks, and in some cases, even months. And of those groups that you mentioned, the stalkers, the terrorists, the mass shooters, the public figures attackers, that's a very important, commonly shared characteristic, that these acts are planned for and prepared for. They're instrumental. They're typically quite predatory. And that's a very important thing to recognize. But see, within that are the diamonds that we look for to be able to identify these acts before they happen. And those little diamonds are clues that those individuals will give us that they're planning and preparing. And those clues become their vulnerability, is they'll display behaviors that tell us that they're on a pathway to violence. So we look for those little crumbs, those little vulnerabilities.
What are these crumbs?
They can hide in the details. So for instance, your 16-year-old is looking at a lot of images of ammunition on his cell phone. He's drawing pictures of somebody with bullet holes in their body, just a simple drawing. He's posting things on his Twitter account or his direct messaging to friends that are disturbing for the friends, but they're hesitant to say anything because they don't want to get him in trouble. Teachers are noticing that he's, the most isolated kid in the room, or he's being teased by other people. See, these are all little behavioral indices that we look for that tell us that there may be a very dark clouds here that we need to pay close attention to. We're always looking for dark clouds on the horizon when it comes to our children, our adolescent children, young adults. And I say those because typically that's where these acts are most likely to be done, typically by adolescents and young adults. You do get older people, of course, carrying out these kinds of acts, but most of these behaviors are going to be adolescents and typically young adults. And now that I'm as old as I am, young adult for me means into your 30s. So but that's typically where you see these behaviors unfolding.
Why are they almost always male, 98%?
Well, males tend to be, just biologically, we know males are more aggressive, and they tend to externalize much more readily than females do. We know that women will tend to, if something's going wrong in their life, women are much more likely to blame themselves. Men are much more likely to blame other people. So we know that, and we also know that that men are just more aggressive biologically, hormonally. If you look at, there's research on looking at just the behavior of toddlers, pre-socialized, before they're even hanging around with other toddlers. Boys will be much more aggressive, much more assertive than girls. So we know that there's a biology here that is also driving these concerns. But we also know the other side of that is that we also know that most males will not be violent, toward other people. So there's also the capacity to inhibit the aggression. Unfortunately, it's not always utilized, and it's not always there.
Dr. Meloy, what is your opinion about preventing school shootings?
Oh, I think to have two things. One is to have teams and tools. And what I mean by a team is to have a multidisciplinary threat assessment team in every school, And then secondly, to have a method by which, that's what I mean by a tool, a method by which to assess for risk in the school. And there are a couple of very, very good programs. One of them, a friend of mine has developed, named Dr. Dewey Cornell, who's at University of Virginia. And he has a program called a comprehensive school threat assessment program. And it's a very good program that has shown success. He just completed a very, very large study in Florida showing its success with there were about 20,000 threat cases in the study. So it was a huge, massive study in the state of Florida, and showed that it was a very effective program for reducing risk. So Dr. Cornell has a very, very good program. And then another friend of mine, John Van Driel, has developed a separate program up in Oregon, which also has gotten a lot of positive attention around the country. And his program came out, it was originally called the Salem-Kaiser Threat Assessment Program for the area in Oregon where this was developed. But that has also become very widely known and very utilized. So there are two very strong programs for high school, that age group, for adolescent age group, to mitigate risk, to lower risk. But those would be my tool thing. You've got to have a team, and you got to have good tools.
Dr. Meloy, for all your life, you have been consulting, researching, I want to say criminal minds, right? And disorders and everything. And does the world become a scary place for you sometimes? And how do you relax after dealing with all that?
Yeah, good question. It's you have to really strike a balance. You have to be very careful to titrate, to not overdose in the work, and you have to recognize that humans have a enormous capacity for both good and evil. I think it was Solzhenitsyn who said, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. And we have to always remember that we have capacities in all of us that are very dark. And then we also have tremendous capacity to be empathic, to love, to be compassionate, and to help other people, and to fully experience that and bring that into your life. I had a friend of mine who passed away a few years ago who said it just beautifully. He said, Our experiences shape us, our decisions define us.
Mhm.
And I thought it was just a beautiful way of capturing how a lot of times we can't control the impact on us and what's going to happen to us in our lives. But we can control the decisions that arise out of those events. And we can decide, how to turn that crisis in our lives into an opportunity to not only help ourselves, but also to help other people. So I try to balance out this dark work with my involvement with my family, nature, uh, being with being with very healthy people, and just really enjoying the beauty surrounding us.
Dr. Meloy, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for everything that you have done for us
Thanks.
today.
Thanks, Savannah. I appreciate it very much. Thanks for the chance to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you.